second class that I do every Wednesday is a Sicha. But I'm not doing a Sicha this week, and I'll tell you why. Again, I started a syllabus 2 years ago where we learn each week a Sicha. We cover a Sicha in a week. But you cannot cover a Sicha in a class. So we skip around. We just do pieces and bits of the Sicha. And the reason is because I'm trying to create a commentary on the stories of the Chumash based on the Rebbe's Sichos. So 2 years ago we started with Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. 2 years ago was the Iyov. Last year, if you go to my website, so in my Sichos section I have a section called Themes. So one of the folders says the Iyov, the second one says Yosef and his brothers, and the third one is Exile and Redemption. So officially 2 years ago we did the Iyov, last year we did Yosef and his brothers, this year we're doing Exile and Redemption. But we didn't finish last year, so I had to spend a significant amount of time in the early part of this year finishing Yosef and his brothers, and we're never going to finish the Exile and Redemption this year because we're still in Shemos. And Exile and Redemption goes till Pekude, so we're going to be here next year. And what I do is each week I pick a Sicha, which is not just a Sicha of the Rebbe on the Pasha, but a Sicha of the Rebbe that reveals the spirit of the story of the Chumash. And that's what we're trying to do. I think these classes are good. And like I said, they're available online. So, and the topic of this is Exile and Redemption. So what we've done in this series on Exile and Redemption is we talked about exile, we talked about slavery, we talked about the miracle of Jewish survival under the worst of conditions. And the last bunch of classes that we had were about Moshe Rabbeinu, the personality. Moshe Rabbeinu is a part of the story, who he was. And one of the aspects of Moshe Rabbeinu which was disturbing to me, and maybe disturbing to you, is the fact that what qualified Moshe Rabbeinu to be the Redeemer was the fact that he didn't participate in our suffering at all. Aaron and Miriam struggled with the Jewish people for 80 years. Miriam's name means bitter. And the reason she was given that name is because from the moment she was born, 86 years, she was born 86 years before left Mitzrayim, 86 Vimat Hashem Elokim, that's when Auschwitz became Auschwitz. And her entire life, she shepherded. She was an old lady when they left Mitzrayim. She was 86 years old. Adam was 84 or 83 years old. Moshe Rabbeinu came out of the wilderness. Didn't suffer a day in his life. He spent the early part of his life in the Pharaoh's palace. And when the Pharaoh lost interest in him, he ran off and he went into Africa. There's Medrash Chazal that say he was a king for many years. There's a Medrash that says he was a king in Ethiopia for 40 years. A whole story. Sefer Yosher. Bottom line is Moshe Rabbeinu reappears in Mitzrayim at the age of 80, not having experienced any of the Yisro HaGolos, and he's the Redeemer. And the Rebbe explained to us, in order to be able to give freedom to slaves, you have to know what freedom is, in effect. So Moshe had to be linked to something above this experience. And the last handful of classes dealt with the personality of Moshe Rabbeinu. However, the very last class already addressed Moshe Rabbeinu's interaction. He meets the Jewish people. And he has this experience where he kills an Egyptian, right? Everybody knows that story, with words. And the next day, he sees two Jews in a fight. And Moshe says, Rosh Allah Masakariyach, evil one, why are you hitting your friend? So these two Jews who were beating each other up now turn on him, and they say to him, you plan to kill me with words like you killed the Egyptian yesterday. It says, Moshe Rabbeinu, Achei Neida David. Achei Neida David has many translations. One of the translations of Achei Neida David is, now I understand why the Jewish people are suffering. It's a very uncomfortable translation. Achei Neida, now I understand why the Jewish people are suffering. They hate each other. They're political people. They're all suffering together. But they'll turn on one another in a minute. And they'll inform. Like they say in the mafia, they'll rat. They'll maser. And Moshe says, now I understand. So there's Rashi and the Rebbe Sikha. And what the Rebbe says in the Sikha is this. So the Jews did a lot of terrible things. They were pagan. They were immersed in 49 gates of spiritual impurity. And God was going to redeem them, in spite of all of that. Moshe has, however, a premonition. The Jewish people can do anything wrong and God can spare them, except one thing. And the one thing that if the Jewish people were to do, it would offset, it would preclude, it would not allow for them to become a nation, is to not to be loyal to each other. And this is what Moshe says, he's going to go and tell the Pare that I killed a Mitzri for killing a Jew, they'll never become a people. They're so political. They're so disloyal. They're slaves in Egypt, being treated like cattle. And what did Moshe Rabbeinu do? He, in the worst case, never insulted a guy. And he runs to the Pharaoh and reports, says, Moshe, they'll never become a nation, because a nation has to be loyal to each other. And you can do whatever you want, but loyalty needs to be a group of people who turn on each other at the drop of a hat are not a people. And the only requisite, the only thing Hashem would not tolerate, the only thing it could offset, that could make it impossible for the Jewish nation to become the nation of God, Avodah Zarah wasn't a problem. But this loyalty was. And Moshe Rabbeinu observes this, and it shocks him. It shocks him. He cannot believe that because he called a Jew a Rasha, he'll go and tell Pharaoh. Pharaoh's killing Jews like insects, like in the concentration camps. And they went and told Pharaoh. And Moshe has to run away. And it shatters Moshe Rabbeinu. It doesn't shatter Moshe Rabbeinu because he almost lost his life. He shatters Moshe Rabbeinu because Moshe Rabbeinu finally understands how difficult this is. You know, what's the greatest thing about the Jewish people? A people of a stiff neck. What's the worst thing about the Jewish people? A people of a stiff neck. Jews are the funniest people in the world. We look after each other, yeah? But when we start competing, cutthroat is an understatement. A Jew helps a Jew. You're rich, I'm poor, no problem. We're both rich, we can eat each other up alive. We're both poor, eat each other alive. Gossip, competition, jealousy. It's so interesting that, the Jewish people are very interesting people. And Moshe says maybe they're not worthy of becoming a nation. Forget about their paganism, forget about their secularism. But to be a nation, they have to accept each other and be loyal to each other. He just turned on me. And he went to Pare, the man who's the source of all their suffering, and informed, because I insulted him. And Moshe says, this was the last Sicha we learned. Now, I'll be very, very honest. There is a Sicha drought for the middle of Parashat Shemos. There's Pashat no Sichas on what happens next. What happens next is Moshe runs away, and he ends up in Midian, and he's on the well, and he meets Midian's daughters, and the shepherds send Midian's daughters running, because Midian was an outcast, because Yisro, was an outcast. Moshe sticks up for these girls. He had 7 daughters. Moshe sticks up for them, and he waters their sheep. They come home much earlier than they normally did, and they say, Ish Mitzri hitzilanu miyad harayim. There was an Egyptian man who saved us from the shepherds, and he gave us water. So Yisro says, Kiran levi yoichalachem. Bring him here. And Rashi says, maybe he'll marry one of you. Because nobody wanted to marry Yisro's daughters. And Moshe marries Tzipora. And he stays in Moshe's house for many, many years. And then eventually he has a calling. He goes out into the desert, and he meets the burning bush, and Hashem talks to him, and he gets permission from his father-in-law, and he goes back to Egypt, and the rest is history. So there's no Sichos in the middle of the Pash. The next Sichos are already in the negotiation between Moshe and Hashem. So what I'm going to do this week is simply talk us from where we are to where we're going to be. In other words, I'm not doing a Sicha today, because there are no Sichos on the middle of the Parsha. So I'm going to have a conversation with you. I'm going to discuss with you what the Chumash says. I actually made a copy of myself of Parshat Shemos. And in Mitzvah next week, we'll have another Sicha, but we'll have covered in this few minutes what happened in the years in between. So first of all, there's a Medrash, I think it's a Sefer HaYashar, that said that Moshe went to Africa. And he spent 40 years as a king in Ethiopia, northern India, which was East Africa. And then he had to leave. You know why he had to leave? Because at a certain point, the people of this country decided that the king has to get married and have children. And Moshe couldn't marry an African woman, because we know from the Chumash that Hashem had cursed the Bnei Canaan, and Moshe couldn't even tell them why, because they would have killed him. So he disappeared. And he went back into Asia, right? Ethiopia is in Africa. Midian is in the Arabian desert, or the Sinai desert. And Moshe was returning, basically. And he came across a well and a bunch of shepherds. And Moshe already knew that there's a long tradition of tzaddikim meeting their wives by wells, right? Yitzchak met his wife by a well, Yaakov met his wife by a well, Moshe comes to a well. Well, what do you think happens next? He finds his wife. Now the Midrashim tell us that Yisro put Moshe Rabbeinu in a dungeon. And he was expecting Moshe Rabbeinu to die. And Tzipora was feeding him for many, many years. And when Moshe Rabbeinu didn't die, Yisro decided this guy's Superman, he can live without food. So he pulls him out of the dungeon, and Tzipora marries Moshe Rabbeinu. Another little part of the story, which is also not discussed enough, is that in Yisro's garden there was a staff that was planted, a stone, a stick that was made from sapphire. It was unbelievably heavy, and I don't know how they explain it. There was from Gan Eden, from other medicine, and Moshe Rabbeinu pulls it out of the ground. Yisro knew that whoever pulls this stick out of the ground is very extraordinary. This stick had on it the letters of the 10 Makkos, the Tzach Adash Bacha. When we read, after we do Dam Tzfazeh by the Seder, we do the abbreviation. Those letters are on that staff. Moshe Rabbeinu takes this stick with him. It's made of stone, made of incredibly heavy, and this is the stick with Moshe Rabbeinu performs all of the miracles. And eventually they get married, they have one child, and then of course she's pregnant with the second child, and Moshe Rabbeinu is called back to Mitzrayim, and so on. But what's very important to bring into the discussion here is, who was Yisro? Who is Yisro? Yisro is a very, very important person in the Chumash. The reason Yisro is an important person in the Chumash is because Yisro was the smartest guy in the world who actually went from smart to simple. The Zohar says amazing things about Yisro. According to Zohar, Yisro was Moshe Rabbeinu's counterpart. Moshe Rabbeinu was Chachma Vatzilus, unbelievably intelligent. The Shekhinah rested upon him. The counterpart, the Zelu Umazev, Moshe was Yisro. He was an incredibly smart man. And the Chazal say, Rashi says, there wasn't an idol worship in the world that he had not attempted. He tried them all. And he was Kohen, he was a priest to the various forms of idolatry. But he evolved. He eventually graduated. In other words, he eventually realized that this was not the truth. He came to believe in one God. And what did he get for it? He was ostracized. He became an apocatus. He became a blasphemer against the blasphemy. You understand? He objected to the polytheistic, to the many-God version of life that the people knew at that time, and he acknowledged one invisible God who's the master of heaven and earth, and Hashgacha Pratis, and so on and so forth. And because of this, Yisro was ostracized. Why is this important? It's important because the Zohar says that if Yisro does not join the Jewish people don't get the Torah. The Zohar says that if Yisro does not join the Jewish people don't get the Torah, because he represents Chochma v'Yumah, the Chochma of Klippa. Moshe represents Chochma of Kedusha, Yisro represents Chochma of Klippa, and the giving of the Torah required that Klippa should submit to Kedusha. In the personality of Yisro, you have the perfect convert, because he was the least likely person to convert. He was the furthest thing away from serving Hashem, and he becomes a Jew. And his children live in Eretz Yisrael, they become assimilated to the Jewish nation, and so on. But Yisro is not just an individual. Yisro was an incredibly great man, an unbelievably intelligent person, but he by himself came to the conclusions that the Eibishter would give the Jewish people in the Torah, and his presence sets the stage for Matan Torah. And of course, the beginning of the story is that he's Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, Moshe Rabbeinu's Shver. So Yisro is a very, very important personality in the story. It's not just Coincidental, there was a guy named Yisro with 7 daughters. One of his daughters' names was Tipora, and she was feeding Moshe while Yisro thinking he was starving him. So eventually Moshe marries Tipora. That's true. But what's more meaningful, the subtext, the pnimius of it is, Yisro is not just a person that happens to be part of the story. He's a person who's very critically part of the story, because it's all about his personality. Yisro was a very intelligent person, and he belonged to Klippa. And he came to the truths of Kedusha. So Moshe's meeting Yisro and marrying Yisro's daughter is not just the story of Moshe. It's very, very much the story of Yisro. And there's another version to the story. There's another aspect to the story. There's another dimension to the story. And the additional dimension is this. It says in Chazal, it could even be it's a Gemara, but it's for sure Chazal. That's when Pare made the Exile against the Jewish people, they consulted 3. He had a meeting with 3 great minds and consulted with them about how to treat the Jewish people. Does anybody know who the 3 were? Yisro, Iyov, and Bilaam. Now, Yisro, Iyov, and Bilaam were physical people. But in addition to Yisro, Iyov, and Bilaam being physical people, Yisro, Iyov, and Bilaam are 3 prototypes. In other words, I've told this to you before. The Gemara has like 5 or 6 opinions when Iyov lived. Are you aware of this? There's an opinion that Iyov lived in the time of Avraham Avinu. There's an opinion that Iyov lived in the time of Yankov Avinu. They lived in the time of the Golus Mitzrayim. We lived in the time of David HaMelech and the time of Yirmiyah. And of course, the last opinion is, anybody know what the last opinion is? That there was no such person. There was no such person. And just to add intrigue to this, does anybody know who wrote the book of Iyov? Who wrote Job? I'll give you a hint. It's going to surprise you. Moshe Rabbeinu. Iyov is the oldest sefer of Tanakh. Moshe Kosav Sefer Iyov. If you ever looked at Job, and I don't know if you ever have, the strangest mythology, the weirdest dragons and ghosts and goblins are in Sefer Iyov. It's the oldest sefer of the Tanakh. It's older than Yeshua, it's older than Sheftim, it's older than the Ksuvim. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Sefer Iyov. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Sefer Iyov. It's ancient. So the question becomes, how could Moshe Rabbeinu have written the book of Job if Job lived in the time of Jeremiah, which is 1,000 years later? Almost. And of course the answer is, Iyov is a person, but Iyov is also a concept. These 3 individuals, Yisro, Iyov, and Bilaam, share one character trait. They're all goyim, and they're all brilliant. They're all brilliant. But their ends are very, very different. Let's start with Bilaam. Bilaam was incredibly intelligent. Bilaam was a prophet. There's an opinion in the Gemara, listen to this, that Bilaam was a greater prophet even than Moshe Rabbeinu. When it says in the Chumash, "Lekom oid navi b'Yisrael kamesha," that the Jewish people would never have another prophet like Moshe Rabbeinu, says the Gemara, "B'Yisrael lekom, ava b'umeis ha'olam kam." The Jews would never have such a prophet again, but the Gentiles would. And who is that? Bilaam. You imagine such a Gemara? You have an idea how intelligent, how spiritual, how sensitive Bilaam was? And what was Bilaam? He was the pervert of perverts. He was the low life of low life. He was the animal of animals. He was a Rosh Merusha. God gave him such wisdom, such intelligence, such sensitivity, and he exploited it for wealth and material indulgences. He was an animal. But the potential that Bilaam had was unbelievably great. So Bilaam was a man, but Bilaam is a concept. There could have been 100 Bilaams. And that's how you understand what the Gemara says. When did Job live? And the answer is, there were many Job characters, but they may never have been an actual Job. If you've ever read the story of Iyov, he lived 210 years, which is a considerable life. And his life was divided up into 70, and then the other 140. The Gemara says somebody should live exactly like that. Never happened. But the idea of an Iyov existed 100 times. It doesn't have to be one, there can be many. Because what does Iyov represent? If Bilaam represents, as I just described it, an individual who was given incredible intelligence, he was a prophet. He was so sensitive. And he was an animal. He was an animal. Job is the middle character. Who is Job? Job is a very, very good man. He's a very, very moral man. But he breaks under pressure. He broke under pressure. The Gemara says that. The Eibishter tested him and tested him. I don't know if you know the story of Iyov, the way the Gemara tells the story. The Gemara explains the story of Iyov that God was pretty angry at the Jewish people. He was pretty angry at the Jews. He was very angry at the Jews. So he had an idea, an interesting idea, a novel idea. I'll start over again. We'll start from the beginning again. So the Eibishter decides he wants to start from the beginning again. Who do you think he consulted? The Satan. The Satan. That's the Sefer Iyov. Why? Why did he consult the Satan? I'll tell you why he consulted the Satan. Because what does the Jewish nation begin with? One man. Avraham. Who do you think Avraham was? Avraham was Iyov. Avraham was Job. Avraham was Job. What do you mean Avraham was Job? There were 100 Jobs. Job means a non-Jew who's unbelievably intelligent, who questions everything and comes to the conclusion that there's one God. Avraham was Iyov. There were many Iyovs. One of them was Avraham. So the Eibishter comes to the Satan and says, maybe you can find me another Abraham. That's the story. Please close the door. So this is the story of Sefer Iyov. The Satan gets in the Eibishter's face. The Satan gets in the Eibishter's face and says, listen, Eibishter, you know I'm not a nice guy. I'm Satan. I represent evil. I just want to tell you something, Eibishter. From my experience, you're not getting another Avraham. It's not happening again. You're stuck with these Jews. Because a man like Avraham, never going to happen again. And the Eibishter says, look at Job, he's a tzaddik. So the Satan says, he's a tzaddik? Squeeze him. See what happens. And they squeeze him, and they squeeze him, and they squeeze him. He loses his wealth, he loses his family, he loses his health. Hashem says to the Satan one thing. Keep him alive. Otherwise, do whatever you want to him. And the Gemara says he blasphemes. He's chide v'gidif. He becomes, he can't believe it. He gives up on God. He goes against the belief in Hashgacha Pratis. There's no way that God is making him suffer so much. And the Satan is vindicated. So Iyov is not a person, just like Bilaam is not a person. It's a concept, a giant of a human being. Bilaam represents this incredibly great man who uses his intelligence and his spirituality and his sensitivity for the lowest level of perverseness. And Iyov is sitting on the fence. Wait. Your nervousness is making me nervous. And when it gets too tough, he cracks. And the third personality is Yisro, Jethro. Also an unusual human being. He represents Chochmah of Midian. He had an incredibly great neshama of Klippa. He understood all the wisdom, all the knowledge, all the secrets. In other words, Bilaam, Iyov, and Yisro were not just three guys. They represented the greatest of humanity. The greatest of humanity. Not just the greatest of intelligence, but the greatest of spirituality. And they fall. Bilaam falls here. Iyov tore his pants sitting on the fence. And Yisro falls here. Yisro is as skeptical and mistrusting and pagan as everybody else. But he graduates from it and comes to Mount Sinai. So the Chazal tell us that the Pharaoh got these three characters together and consulted with them what he should do about the fact that there's a population explosion amongst the Hebrews. So Bilaam says, kill him. Yossi says, why kill him? They're good people. And Iyov says, I don't know. So Bilaam, who condemns the Jewish people, gets condemned. Yisro, who defends the Jewish people, joins the Jewish people at Har Sinai. Iyov, who's afraid of tearing his pants because he's sitting on the fence, tears a lot more than his pants. This is a medrash. What I'm trying to explain to you is that Bilaam is a person. He lived historically. Yisro is a person who lived historically. Iyov is a person who lived historically. But when you read these stories in the Torah, these are more than just individual people. There could have been 100 Bilaams. In other words, when you read in Kabbalah Sfarim that so-and-so was an incarnation of Bilaam, this is not just Kabbalistic. This is also human. It's also psychological. It's also real. As much as we don't like to admit this, that there is such a thing as smart people and simple people. And then there are geniuses, brilliant people. Brilliant people. All of three of these men represented the highest levels of what a human being could be. And one used it for utter evil, The other used it for utter goodness at incredible cost. You know what it means? His daughters were harassed at the well. They couldn't get water out of the well. Imagine being the smartest person in the world and no one tells you good morning. They treat your children like trash. For what? For saying the truth. And then you have Iyov sitting on the fence. So this personality, Yisro, whose daughter Moshe Rabbeinu marries, is a very, very important personality. In other words, we're not just, Yisro doesn't show up on the Chumash coincidentally. Moshe had to get married, his wife had to have a name, she probably had a father and a mother, so we know who they were. Nah. This is as much a story about Yisro as it's a story about Yisro and Moshe Rabbeinu. And before Moshe Rabbeinu comes to redeem the Jewish people from Mitzrayim, Yisro joins. Yisro is involved as a prerequisite. Because ultimately it says in Zohar, if Yisro does not show up in the desert, Hasina never happens. Because Yisro is the non-Jew who joins Avraham Avinu. And again, this is now my words. Avraham Avinu is the Job who doesn't stay sitting on the fence. Avraham Avinu is the Job who gets off the fence. Yisro was never on the fence. He was a pagan, he was an idolater, he was an Eved Avodah Zarah, and he joins Moshe Rabbeinu. So this entire part of Sefer Shemos, for whatever reason, there are no Likutei Sichos. The Rebbe didn't.
Why?
Because they didn't have enough years. I mean, the Rebbe Sichos were one a year per week. I don't know the reason. So I'm sharing this now, so that next week, when we reconvene, we'll start talking about what happens. What happens is, he spends all these years in Ethiopia, according to the Midrash Chazal. He appears in Midian, he spends I don't know how many years in a dungeon, and then he marries Tzippai, they live together for many, many years. He's Yisro's shepherd. And by the way, Moshe Rabbeinu as a shepherd, no problem. Why? Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't need books. Moshe Rabbeinu just needs the sky and a place to meditate. There could be no greater career for Moshe Rabbeinu than being a shepherd. His time is his own. And of course we all know the Medrash that one of the Shepselach ran away and Moshe runs after him and brings him water. And how the Eibishter says, if he has such concern for sheep, he'll certainly have so much concern for my children. And that's what qualifies Moshe Rabbeinu to become the leader of the Jewish people. All of this is in Parshas Shemos. And what we'll do next week is we'll continue the story that I just started with the burning bush. Okay, so now you ask your question, and then you'll be next.
I have two really short questions. They're not long.
You understand that the answers are not determined by the length of the question.
So the first thing is, that's why Yisro was like, they named him after the Parsha, right?
Right, sure.
That was it. So my turn. It says in Iyov, Hashem gives and Hashem takes away. Blessed be the name of Hashem. I thought that.
We've had this conversation before.
I don't know.
In the Sefer of Iyov, there's 5 personalities. There's 5 different people, and they take turns speaking. So you have to see who said that. You can't ask a question. There's 5 different people. The whole book of Iyov is a book of theology. You have these friends come to console him. And one chapter is one friend, the next chapter is another friend, another chapter is Iyov himself. At the end of the book, a 5th guy shows up, and he's the one who has it right. So I don't know who said those words. Hashem Nasan Hashem Lakach, Yishem Hashem. It could have been not Iyov. But I don't remember the book of Iyov well enough to know who told it to you. Said it, but again, it may not very well not have been Iyov himself. At the end, the Gemara says Iyov failed. Hashem squeezed him, and he said the wrong thing.
Why was Moshe a dungeon?